Alrighty, welcome back, guys. Today we're going to cover Chapter 2, which the title of is Constitutional Democracy. So we're going to talk about the founding documents and kind of how we arrived at the type of government that we have. Okay, so a couple of things we're going to do today. We're going to define the concept of judicial review, and we're going to contrast the original system for electing federal officials with the system that we have today. Okay, so prior to having a constitution, obviously we were a colony for a little while, so we had traditions of limited and representative government as a result of that, right? So when we were a collection of colonies, we had certain complaints about the government that we were getting from England, right? So we had the issue that we didn't get any representation in the government. So when we decided we wanted to create our own government, we wanted to make sure that there were limits on power, so we don't have a tyrannical leader like a king who can do whatever he wants, and we want to make sure that the people who are being governed get a say in what the government looks like. So we took all of our complaints for how we were governed by England and we transformed our own government into what we thought was a better solution than the government we had had previously. So we advocated for limited government, which means there are limitations on ways that the government can exercise power over us, and they need to be clear, written down. And then also representative government is going to be a government full of people that are elected by the people to represent them. Okay, so you have a House member who goes to Congress, you have a senator who goes to Congress. They are going to be the ones writing the federal laws, and you can contact your congressman to tell him what you think before he goes and votes on any of the bills, etc. Okay, so your voice is part of the decision-making process. Obviously, we had lots of complaints about how England did things, but there were a couple of things from our British heritage that we copied. So we liked the idea of the British Parliament, where there are where there's a big chamber of members who work together to write the laws. Okay, and then we also had colonial charters, which were like founding documents for each of the colonies. And then we liked some of the ideas like the rights of Englishmen, where people were entitled to a trial by jury before they got punished for a crime. So we were able to collect some bits and pieces of what we liked from England and kind of incorporate it into our government system while avoiding all of the pitfalls of having a king and having taxation without representation. Okay, so things we disliked about Britain. Obviously, we didn't like the monarchy. We have never had a king in the United States, and that's on purpose. And we don't like being taxed when we don't get a say in what that money is being spent on, how much the tax is, who gets the tax, etc. And so basically, because of these grievances that we had with Britain, we met in 1774 to discuss declaring independence as a nation of our own instead of British colonies. Okay, so when we were declaring independence, there were a lot of influences on the people who actually wrote the Declaration of Independence. So one of those was philosopher John Locke, who you may have heard about in your U.S. history class if you took history in Texas, right? So he had a couple of concepts that are present in our founding documents. So one of those is the social contract, which is the agreement that we put power in the government with the expectation that they are going to protect our rights in exchange. Otherwise, we wouldn't give them power, right? So all of the freedoms that we exercise in our day-to-day life, that we can protest, that we can report on the news, that we can disagree with the government and say what we want and make whatever we want to out of our lives, we are putting power in the federal, state, and local government as an exchange for them protecting our rights, okay? And then also the concept of inalienable rights were from John Locke as well. Those are the rights of life, liberty, and property. So we use a slightly different list for our unalienable rights in the U.S. Constitution. We used life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but close enough. That's kind of where we pulled that from. So when Thomas Jefferson was actually writing out the Declaration of Independence, he paraphrased and said life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. For a little while before it was pursuit of happiness, it was actually happenstance, which is like a fancy word for opportunity. But basically, we want self-determination, right? We want our lives to turn out however we want them to turn out. We don't want a king telling us what our life is going to be like, or that we're going to be a peasant until we die, you know? Also inside of the Declaration of Independence was the phrase that all men are created equal, which is ironic because, you know, we went on to have slaves for 200 years and people are still treated exceptionally unequally, right? And then also paraphrased was the idea that governments derive power from the consent of the governed, right? So the government is only powerful because the people agree to let them have that power in the exchange for the government protecting our rights, okay? So like the US government is going to provide for the national defense and is going to protect the American way of life. So if we have enemy countries who want to like do us harm, right, and infringe upon our rights, the US government is going to take the authority that we gave to it and it is going to protect our rights that we have to, you know, live our American way of life, basically. So that's kind of where that came from, is the philosopher John Locke. He had written a number of, I think treatises is what they called them, where he talked about life generally and government, and we pulled a lot from his writing. All right, so after we declared independence, we did not go straight to writing a constitution. All of those colonies basically wanted to be their own states, and they wanted to have an alliance between states that we were all on the same team as each other, but we were not willing to give a bunch of power to a central government because what we wanted to avoid was another all-powerful king situation. So during the American Revolution, we established the Articles of Confederation, okay? So this was going to be the agreement between states, what the government was going to look like. We were all going to be on the same team against Britain, and we were not going to have a strong national government that was going to push us around as the new states, okay? So they intentionally, inside of the Articles of Confederation, created a weak national government. So most of the decision-making power during this time period belonged with the states, and they could operate pretty much independently, just under the assumption that they were working together with the other colonies or states, okay? So as you can imagine, that's kind of problematic to be fighting a revolutionary war, but you established a federal government that is incredibly weak, right? Because some of the importance of having a federal government there are some things that only the federal government can do, right? So Congress, for example, did not give the federal government the power to tax, okay? And so if you cannot raise money, you cannot pay a military, right? You cannot purchase weapons, you cannot get uniforms, you cannot feed the military. You are relying entirely on like militias that are coming from each of the colonies where people just volunteer and maybe have their own weapons, right? And they're fighting this battle for you, okay? All of the states retain sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and that makes things kind of complicated, right? If you have a revolution going on, you don't want one colony advocating for one thing and another colony advocating for something else. You want everybody to be on the same page. You want them to be in agreement before you make a big decision that's going to impact everybody on the continent, right? So anytime they wanted to change the Articles of Confederation, they needed unanimous consent to approve the amendments, right? So if there was one colony who said, I don't want to give the federal government the power to tax me, they're going to take all of my money, then they couldn't amend it. So that made the United States in its infancy extremely weak, because there was no one above the state governments who could make binding decisions that applied to everybody, because they gave the national government such weak power. Very different from how it operates today. So that came to a head with Shays' Rebellion, which I'm going to play you a short clip about.
(1786). The American Revolution had just ended, and the new nation was in its infancy. But while America celebrated its independence, a storm was brewing in the countryside. This was the setting for one of the most significant, yet often overlooked, events in U.S. history: Shays' Rebellion. For many farmers, particularly in western Massachusetts, life after the Revolution was harsh and seemed only to be getting worse. Debt, high taxes, and a lack of support from the government fueled their frustration. Several key issues led to a growing anger and ultimately an uprising. First, farmers were dealing with crippling debt. After the war, farmers returned home to neglected farms and large debts. They struggled to get back on their feet. Secondly, there was the issue of not being paid for military service. Many of the farmers were veterans who had not been paid for their service in the American Revolution. This lack of compensation left them in financial ruin. Thirdly, the burden of high taxes. Massachusetts imposed taxes higher than those under British rule to pay off war debt. Farmers, already struggling, found these taxes unbearable. Fourthly, the requirement of payments in hard currency. The government demanded taxes be paid in scarce gold or silver, which made it nearly impossible for farmers to pay. Fifthly, the issue of foreclosures and imprisonment. When farmers couldn't pay, their farms were seized, and some were even sent to debtors' prison. This pushed many to the brink of desperation. Lastly, there was a serious lack of government support. Instead, the government courts sided with creditors and continued to allow farm seizures. The farmers felt abandoned by the very government they had fought to create. By 1786, the farmers had had enough. Led by a former Revolutionary War captain, Daniel Shays, they began to organize. Their goal, to stop the courts from seizing their land and imprisoning them for their debts. Shays and his supporters shut down courthouses across Massachusetts, preventing judges from issuing foreclosures. For months, the rebellion spread. The farmers wanted economic relief, lower taxes, paper currency, and an end to the debtors' prison. In January 1787, the rebellion reached its climax. Shays and a group of nearly 1,500 rebels marched on the federal arsenal in Springfield, hoping to seize weapons and making their demands known. But the state militia, funded by wealthy merchants, was ready. The confrontation was brief but bloody. The rebellion was crushed, and Shays' forces were scattered. Some of the rebels were arrested and tried, with 2 of the men being executed for their role in the uprising. Daniel Shays avoided being arrested by fleeing to Vermont. In 1788, in an effort to ease tensions, the Massachusetts government decided to pardon Shay and his followers. Shays lived the rest of his life in poverty, dying in 1825. What was the impact of the rebellion? Though the rebellion was over, its impact was just beginning. This was because Shays' rebellion sent shockwaves throughout the nation. The federal government, under the Articles of Confederation, was too weak and had been powerless to stop the uprising. There was no national army to defend the arsenal, no authority to keep the peace throughout the nation. The uprising convinced states that the country needed a new constitution, a new government. This led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where the Founding Fathers decided to draft a new constitution, one that would give the new federal government much more power. Though Daniel Shays' rebellion was short-lived, its legacy is lasting. It helped pave the way for the Constitution that governs the United States today.
All right, so as you can imagine, the Articles of Confederation basically went into the trash. You can imagine what kind of cluster it was for them to expect all of these farmers and merchants to step away from their day job to fight the Revolutionary War, to come home, not get paid for all of that time, struggle to support their family after going unpaid for months, and then when they go back to work their farmland, they're getting surprised by these insanely high taxes to pay back the war debt. And where are they supposed to get this money from? They've been out of work for 6 months to go fight the Revolutionary War. So never before had the government really considered the fact that when you have such a weak government, there's nobody to quell rebellions like these, right? So when the farmers were threatened with foreclosures on their land during the Revolution, they rebelled, right? And it was really violent and bloody. And in order to prevent something like that from ever happening again, the states finally agreed that the Articles of Confederation weren't cutting it, that we needed to draft a constitution with a federal government that was strong enough to have taxing power, to raise a national army that was actually going to be paid, right? And that has the authority to squish rebellions that come up like this. So that was the impetus for the creation of our existing Constitution. Okay, so naturally constitutions aren't written overnight. We had delegates from all across the states come together and meet in Philadelphia, where they were going to workshop the document and actually come up with what the new government was going to look like. And as you can imagine, that is not something that it's easy to get a bunch of people to agree on all in 1 or 2 days, okay? So they were given the opportunity to just revise the Articles of Confederation, but they ignored those instructions and just started over from scratch because the Articles of Confederation were just such a disaster, okay? So what they did was started completely from scratch, where they outlined every single power that the federal government was going to have, what all of the branches were going to be, how those branches were going to check and balance each other, and put clear limitations on what the government couldn't do as kind of training wheels to prevent anything tyrannical from happening, right? So we gave the central government all of the power necessary to do its job. We gave explicit power, like the power to apply taxes, levy taxes, and then we also gave it the power to print a national currency, right? Which, as you can imagine, is very important. During Shays' Rebellion, they were demanding these taxes be paid in silver and gold, and nobody had silver and gold, so how were they supposed to pay them, right? So we needed to circulate a national currency that everybody had, so everybody can pay their tax in the same money, if that makes sense. Okay, so there were a couple of different plans for how this was going to look. So we had pretty much agreed that there needed to be an executive branch, like a president of some sort, and they were going to handle that realm of activity. We knew we wanted a judicial branch that was going to be the court system, and we knew that we wanted to have a legislature, kind of like Parliament, but we didn't know exactly what we wanted that to look like. So depending on which state you represented, you may have had a different idea for what that legislature should have looked like. So these are the three options that they were negotiating between, okay? So the Virginia plan would have been the Southern states plans, right, was representation based on state population. So they wanted bigger states with more people to have more representation in the legislature, to advocate for their ideals. So the bigger your state was, the more power you would have in the new federal government. Okay, as you can imagine, if you were a small state with not very many people, you would not like this plan because you would imagine that they're going to trample all over whatever your state wants. Okay, so the New Jersey plan of the northern states was the opposite. They wanted each state to get one vote. That way it would equalize the power between small states and large states, and they would actually have to come to a compromise without anybody having the advantage just based on how many people lived there. You would have to compete for the best idea, right? And that was what some of the northern states wanted. And then the great compromise that we actually came to is, instead of having a unicameral legislature, like in England they have parliament and it's just one parliament. In the US, however, we compromised and we did a bicameral legislature, which means there are two chambers. So we divided the legislature into the House of Representatives and the Senate. Okay, all of these people are going to be elected. All of these people are going to be geographically diverse. They're going to come from all the different states, but each chamber is going to be picked in a different way to give smaller or larger states the advantage. So everybody has an advantage somewhere, and it kind of equalizes the power. Okay, so in the House of Representatives, we have 435 House representatives, and they're going to be found all across the United States, and they're going to be awarded to states based on population. So if Texas has a large population, we will have more representatives in the House of Representatives than Wyoming that nobody lives there, right? So in the House, Texas would have the advantage over a state like Wyoming where nobody lives. Okay, in the Senate, we're going to do equal representation. So every single state is going to have 2 senators regardless of their population. Okay, so in this case, there would be equal representation of large states and small states, where ideally there would be a compromise of ideas, and it gives small states more of a voice than they would have otherwise had if we just had a House of Representatives. Okay, so as you can imagine, we had lots of issues early on in the United States. So Congress agreed to tax imports only and not exports. So if you were selling things outside of the country as a merchant, at least it was not going to be taxed on the way out. And as part of the agreement, Congress said that they were not going to ban slavery until at least 1808. Okay, so we had to come to an agreement that, you know, in the South they wanted slaves still, in the North they weren't as dependent on it. So we decided basically to kick that can down the road and decide at a later date, just in order to get the government functioning and get everybody on the same page. So we said at least until 1808 we will not ban slavery. We'll talk about it in 1808. Then for calculating population and representation, obviously there's the issue of, do we count the slaves or do we not count the slaves, right? So if you lived in a slave state, you wanted to count the slaves because you wanted to have as much influence in the legislature as possible. But if you were a Northerner, you didn't want to count the slaves because those people aren't voting anyway, and you don't have any slaves, so there's no way for you to gain any advantage, and you're actually the good guy. You don't own slaves, right? So there was a lot of discussion as to how we would calculate population and representatives in the House of Representatives, and lots of argument between the Northerners and Southerners, basically because the South had a lot more people. They weren't free people, but they thought that should equal out to more representation because there were more physical bodies in the South, okay? So the way that they compromised for that is they said that each slave would count as 3/5 of a person, okay? So it was the compromise between not counting them and counting them. They would count them, but they would not count them as a full human being. So we refer to that in history as the 3/5 compromise, where the South would get a little bit more representation, but not like the full amount, because of course all of these slaves are not voters anyway, but that was the best they could come to in their like stalemate where they didn't agree on how to move forward. Okay, so as you can imagine, in the northern states that we had, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, they had like 1 to 2% of the population being slaves. So they got no advantage from counting the slaves, and they thought it would be unfair to count the slaves. Compared to like Virginia, South Carolina, their slave population was almost half of the people there. So the people in the South would have doubled their representation if we counted slaves as entire people, okay? So the 3/5 compromise is the best they could come up with to at least move forward with the government, because there was no way that they were going to come to an agreement about not counting them entirely or counting them entirely. Okay. So, in addition to the legislative branch, we knew we wanted an executive branch. So the delegates basically agreed on what powers the president should have once he or she is elected. But they couldn't really agree on how many people should head the executive branch. Like, should it be one president? Should it be a president and a vice president? Should others be up near the president? Like, how many should there be total? And then once it's time to elect the president, how do we elect this person? So they voted over and over and over again on the different variations of what the executive branch would look like before they agreed that we will have one president, okay? And during this time period, they adopted the Electoral College, where each state has electors equal to the number of members in Congress, and then those electoral votes get counted up to determine who is the president instead of the popular vote, which is just one person, one vote, and majority wins, right? So after we had just done the 3/5 compromise, that would give a huge advantage to the slave states in terms of picking a president. Okay, so that is the whole reason the Electoral College exists, is so we can give more voting strength to the southern slave states, because their number of members in Congress is directly tied to how many 3/5 of a person we are counting as slaves down there in the South. Okay, so this meant that they had more sway over who became president instead of the North, or it being equal. So this is what the electoral map looks like. It's based on population now. Now that Black people are counted as entire human beings, hallelujah, the electoral purpose or electoral college doesn't really serve a purpose anymore other than to make elections confusing, right? Since there is no advantage to owning slaves, not owning slaves, and every person in the country, regardless of their ethnicity, is counted the same, It's one of these things that doesn't actually serve a purpose in present day. It's just kind of left over from a past time where we were way more racist. So now that's why you sometimes have an electoral outcome where Hillary Clinton wins the popular vote by however million votes, but she lost the electoral college because those individual votes that she won by were in the wrong state. Okay, so now the electoral college, the way it operates is entire elections are decided by states that are basically swing states. So the more solidly Republican your state is, or the more solidly Democrat your state is, the less likely that a presidential candidate is actually going to come campaign in your state, because it is unlikely for them to change the outcome of your state's election, right? Texas is typically a red state. California is typically a blue state, right? But Michigan, it flips back and forth every year. That would be a place to go campaign because they might win you the election. Or Pennsylvania, that flips back and forth every year. That would be a place to campaign because that could win you the election. So now, all these years later, we have the Electoral College, and it pretty much means that if you're voting from a non-swing state, your vote doesn't actually change the outcome of the election. Like if you were a Democrat and you lived in Texas, your vote does not matter because all of the Electoral College votes for Texas will go to the Republican candidate. So we're going to watch a quick video about the Electoral College.
Most people have heard of the Electoral College during presidential election years. But what exactly is the Electoral College? Simply said, it is a group of people appointed by each state who formally elect the President and Vice President of the United States. To understand how this process began and how it continues today, we can look at the Constitution of the United States. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Constitution. It specifies how many electors each state is entitled to have. Since 1964, there have been 538 electors in each presidential election. How did they decide on the number 538? Well, the number of electors is equal to the total voting membership of the United States Congress, 435 representatives plus 100 senators and 3 electors from the District of Columbia. Essentially, the Democratic candidate and Republican candidate are each trying to add up the electors in every state so that they surpass 270 electoral votes, or just over half of 538 votes, and win the presidency. So how do states even get electoral votes? Each state receives a particular number of electors based on population size. The census is conducted every 10 years, so every time the census happens, states might gain or lose a few electoral votes. Let's say you're a voter in California, a state with 55 electoral votes. If your candidate wins in California, they get all 55 of the state's electoral votes. If your candidate loses, they get none. This is why many presidential candidates want to win states like Texas, Florida, and New York. If you currently add up the electoral votes of those 3 states, you would have 96 electoral votes. Even if a candidate won North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and West Virginia, they would only gain 31 electoral votes total from those 8 states. Here's where it can get a little tricky. On a rare occasion, like in the year 2000, someone can win the popular vote but fail to gain 270 electoral votes. This means that the winner may have won and collected their electoral votes by small margins, winning just enough states with just enough electoral votes, but the losing candidate may have captured large voter margins in the remaining states. If this is the case, the very large margins secured by the losing candidate in the other states would add up to over 50% of the ballots cast nationally. Therefore, the losing candidate may have gained more than 50% of the ballots cast by voters, but failed to gain 270 of the electoral votes. Some critics of the Electoral College argue the system gives an unfair advantage to states with large numbers of electoral votes. Think of it this way. It is possible for a candidate to not get a single person's vote, not one vote, in 39 states or the District of Columbia, yet be elected president by winning the popular vote in just 11 of these 12 states: California, New York, Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, New Jersey, North Carolina, Georgia, or Virginia. This is why both parties pay attention to these states. However, others argue that the Electoral College protects small states such as Rhode Island, Vermont, and New Hampshire, and even geographically large states with small populations like Alaska, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. That's because a candidate can't completely ignore small states, because in a close election, every electoral vote counts. There are certain states that have a long history of voting for a particular party. These are known as safe states. For the past 4 election cycles, in 1996, 2000, 2004, and 2008, Democrats could count on states like Oregon, Maryland, Michigan, and Massachusetts, whereas the Republicans could count on states like Mississippi, Alabama, Kansas, and Idaho. States that are teetering between parties are called swing states. In the past 4 election cycles, Ohio and Florida have been swing states, twice providing electoral votes for a Democratic candidate and twice providing electoral votes for a Republican candidate. Think about it. Do you live in a safe state? If so, is it a Democratic or Republican safe state? Do you live in a swing state? Are your neighboring states swing or safe? Is the population in your state increasing or decreasing? And do not forget, when you're watching the electoral returns on election night every 4 years and the big map of the United States is on the screen, know that the magic number is 270 and start adding.
All right. So, before the Constitution actually became valid and became our government document, it had to be ratified. Okay, so the delegates established their own ratification process for the Constitution. So they submitted it to each of the states that we had at that time period. So 9 states needed to approve in order for us to adopt the Constitution. That happened, and so the Constitution is now our form of government. All right, so that is not to say that there wasn't a debate on ratification. There were some people who were happy with the Constitution in its current form, and there were some people who were not. So we call these groups of people the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. So the Anti-Federalists were against a strong federal government or national government, and they were really concerned about states' rights being trampled, and they wanted the independence that they had been accustomed to continue making their own decisions about slavery and taxes and everything that they had already been doing under the Articles of Confederation. Okay, and that closely aligns with the Republican position nowadays, where they would like the states to decide abortion, the states to decide even how they're going to handle immigration, sometimes it seems, right? So that still exists today in present day politics. Then we have the Federalists, who supported the new Constitution because they said that the Articles of Confederation were such a cluster that we needed a federal government that was going to be powerful enough to protect the interests of the entire country, and we needed it now. So they were advocating for a strong enough federal government. Okay, so people who were included in the Federalists were people like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, and they were actually responsible for writing, you may have heard of it, the Federalist Papers, which were circulated around the country to try to persuade folks to ultimately ratify the Constitution. Okay, so in order to get the Constitution ratified, they came to an agreement that they were going to include a Bill of Rights on the document to satisfy the Anti-Federalists, okay? So the Bill of Rights was going to be the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that were going to list out all of the rights that we were going to protect, right? So we were concerned about, the Anti-Federalists were concerned about all of their rights being trampled on, and so as a compromise, they wanted to list out out each individual right and how they were going to be protected as part of the document in exchange for their vote to ratify. So it was going to list out all of the protected rights and freedoms that American citizens have. These are ones that you would recognize, right, from growing up in the U.S. So freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, right to trial by a jury of your peers, freedom of religion, and limits on power of the central government. Okay, so like the 10th Amendment goes through and says that if it is not specifically listed here in the Constitution, that power belongs to the states. Okay, and that's the kind of promise those anti-federalists really needed in order to ratify the Constitution and be pretty sure that their rights weren't going to be infringed upon as states. Okay, so the framers of the Constitution wanted to strike a balance where the federal government could do its job, but it could not be tyrannical like a king. Okay, so we wanted to make sure that they could coin money and collect taxes and then use those taxes to raise a national army and all of that good stuff, but we didn't want them trampling on states' rights. We still wanted states to have autonomy inside of their state to run their day-to-day lives how they would like to run them, okay? And the framers of the Constitution also distrusted a majority rule system. So the way they saw it, we should not be a two-party system where 51% of votes can do whatever they want against the wishes of the minority. During that time period, it was not just the Republicans and Democrats, right? They warned against a system of two parties warring back and forth. They wanted to do everything in their right to preserve liberty, and that was how they envisioned the future of the government. Okay, so a couple of goals for this government. We wanted it to be strong enough for our national defense to be protected and to negotiate on behalf of the country for our commerce needs, right? So like taxing and trading and all of that good stuff with other countries. And we did not want it to threaten the existence of separate states. So if the South Carolina government wanted to run their state like this, that would not interfere with the New Hampshire government running their state like that. They wanted there to be clear limitations on power, and they wanted everybody to have a voice in their government, unlike the monarchy in Britain. Okay, so the framers limited the government powers by stating what those powers were and being very clear in the document that this is exactly what the government has the power to do. And there are 17 total. And the framers went through and specifically prohibited the government from doing specific other things. Okay, and then what they did to protect all of that they put inside the Constitution is they were going to make it very difficult to amend the Constitution. So I also teach the Texas government class, and I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Texas Constitution has been amended like 507 times. Whereas the federal Constitution, we have not even amended it 100 times, right? And it's because the federal Constitution is very difficult to amend, and they made it on purpose kind of flexible enough to where when stuff pops up, there is implied power necessary for the federal government to carry out its duties, whereas the Texas Constitution gave so little power to the state government that every time something unique pops up, we have to vote on a constitutional amendment to give them a little more power because we didn't know AI was going to exist, or we didn't know crypto was going to exist, etc. All right, so inside of the Constitution, there are specific checks and balances to make sure that no one branch of the government is going to be too powerful that it can overrule any of the other branches, basically. So we want to separate out the powers. Each branch is going to have their own powers, and then the government can check other parts of the government because the responsibilities will like overlap and work in a circle. Let me show you what that looks like. Okay. So we have the Supreme Court, which has the power to check the White House and the power to check Congress. Then we have the executive branch, which can check the Supreme Court and check Congress. And then we have the legislative branch, which can check the Supreme Court and can check the White House. And what do I mean by that? don't stress yourself out trying to write all of these tiny words on the picture. I'm going to show you a better explanation in a couple of slides, but I just needed to show you the diagram. Okay, so first up, we're going to start with the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court. Their responsibility is going to be interpreting the Constitution and determining which laws are constitutional versus are not constitutional, right? So if Congress passes a law and somebody sues and says it's not constitutional, the Supreme Court gets the final say on whether it is acceptable according to the Constitution or not, okay? And they get to check the executive by declaring executive actions unconstitutional. So if the president releases an executive order saying we're closing the border, if the Supreme Court doesn't think that that's constitutional, they can strike it down according to the Constitution. And anytime Congress passes a law that they feel like is unconstitutional, they can strike that down as well, okay? And then anytime there's any kind of lawsuit where there's like something that's unclear about the Constitution or unclear about whatever is lawful, it will get appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court for them to make a determination. So they are like lawyers, and in their career they were judges, and then they worked their way all the way up to the Supreme Court. So these are like the scholars of the Constitution and Supreme Court precedent. These are the folks that are supposed to be the impartial judges of what is constitutional and what is not constitutional. Now, in the last couple of decades, we've been packing the courts with more and more partisan judges, which means instead of being neutral, the judges go onto the court as a Republican or they go onto the court as a Democrat, and they vote for things that either Republicans or Democrats like, kind of irrespective of the Constitution. And that has made kind of a mess of the Supreme Court and has led to some public distrust of the Supreme Court. But ideally, they would be impartial judges of whether something is constitutional or not constitutional, depending, regardless of which branch it comes from. They can check them. Then we have Congress, which is the legislative branch. Their responsibility is going to be to make the laws. So they are going to write the laws and they are going to vote and pass the laws. In addition to the laws, they control the budget. Okay, so they collect tax revenue and then they decide by making laws where that tax revenue gets spent. Okay, so if you have a presidential candidate who campaigns on closing the border and deporting people, for example, he actually does not have the power to do that necessarily because he does not have access to government money unless Congress gives it to him. So if it's going to cost us $30 million to deport however many people, Congress would actually be responsible for legislating and giving him the money to do that in order for him to do it, right? So if you've ever had a presidential candidate who you're like, they didn't like keep their campaign promise, in a lot of cases, it wasn't actually their decision. They may have promised it, but without Congress and without the judicial branch, they could not do it on their own, okay? So Congress can check the president by impeaching him or her if they, I don't know, lead an insurrection on the Capitol. And then also Congress can check the judicial branch by voting to confirm or not confirm judicial appointments, right? So if the president appoints somebody to be a federal judge or if he appoints someone to be a Supreme Court justice, if they are a terrible judge or a terrible justice, Congress can vote against them and say, go nominate someone else, okay? So Congress has lots of power. And then we have the president, who is the executive. They're going to set a policy agenda for the country and make recommendations to Congress on what laws he would like to see come across his desk for him to sign them into law. Okay, so Congress gets to write the budget, and that is a law, right? And then it makes it to the president's desk where he can either sign it into law if he agrees with it, or he can veto it if he disagrees with it. So if Congress wanted to make it easier to become a U.S. citizen. The president, if he didn't like that, could veto it, or if he agreed, he could make it a law. Okay, the president gets to check the legislature by vetoing laws he or she doesn't like, and he gets to check the judicial branch by making judicial appointments. Okay, so this is one of the underrated powers of the president, is that they get to appoint all those judicial nominees. And if you're a Republican, you want a court system full of Republican judges, right? So you are going to find the most right-wing, like conservative judges possible, and you are going to try to appoint as many of them during your presidency as possible, because if somebody sues over one of your government policies, you know what? You want that policy to go before that really conservative judge that you put on the bench, right? Or the really conservative Supreme Court justices that you added to the bench, right? So appointing judges and justices is a really underrated power of the president. All right, the framers of the Constitution were concerned about tyranny of the majority, so they didn't want the 51% to be terrorizing the country against their wishes. They didn't want an irrational mob trampling over the rights of other states just because they had 51%. But in spite of everything they did to try to avoid that happening, that's very much what the country looks like now. They wanted to award people a voice in the government, but you know what? The voice that they used in the government led us to kind of a two-party scenario where whoever's in charge is the 51%ers, and it flips back and forth every 4 years or so. Okay. So democracy, in the eyes of the framer, was a government in which the majority has absolute power, and that is actually not ideal. So what they actually wanted is called a republic, which is a government that has limits on its power, where the people have rights guaranteed by a constitution, and these rights are protected by institutions. And majority rule is limited in order to protect minority rights. So we talked briefly in chapter 1 about how the ideal way for this to work would be for there to be like 5 parties, right? Where inside of Congress we have a good number of independents and a good number of Green Party and a good number of libertarians and a good number of Republicans and Democrats, right? Where no one party had 51%, and instead they would have to work together with parties that are different from them to come to a compromise solution that would be better for America than just what the 51%ers want for themselves, right? So a republic is actually what the framers were going for, instead of a direct democracy where you could rule with 51%, but that's kind of where we landed. Okay, so limited popular rule. The idea was that the House of Representatives was initially the only institution that was based on direct popular election. So to make the government responsive to the regular people, they wanted the House of Representatives to be directly elected, and whoever wins 51% in the election goes to the House of Representatives. And originally the senators would be appointed by the legislatures of their state, okay? That way, each state would have the same number of electoral votes as the members of Congress, and their electors would select the president, okay? So federal judges and justices would also be appointed. So the only thing we changed here is that the senators are now also popularly elected. Okay, so this just puts that whole thing in chart form. So the president is selected through the Electoral College, and how your electoral votes for your state get cast depends on your state constitution. Like if you're in Nebraska, they do proportional electoral votes, where if 66% vote for a Republican and 33% vote for the Democrat, and they have 3 electoral votes, they will actually split their electoral votes up and give some to the Republicans and some to the Democrats. There are only 2 states in the entire union that do that. Every other state does winner takes all, where in Texas, if Donald Trump wins 51% of the votes in Texas, he's going to get all of the electoral electoral votes. And then the president will serve for 4 years and then has to run for re-election for a max of 2 terms. Okay? A U.S. senator used to be picked by the state legislature, but we changed that in 1913, where you actually have to win an election of the people of Texas to be a Texas senator. Okay, senators are going to serve 6-year terms, and they are staggered terms where 1/3 of the senators are being up for re-election every 2 years. Okay, so U.S. representative. So if you're going in the House of Representatives, it's a popular election based on whatever district you live in, and those are 2-year terms. And then federal judges are nominated by the president, and then they're approved by the Senate, okay? And they can spend as much time on the bench as they can before they die or before something crazy happens and they have to be impeached, but we tend to not impeach these people even when they do a bad job. Okay, so couple of different pictures of what democracy could have looked like. So Jeffersonian democracy was that the government belonged to all and not just the elite. So everybody got a say in the government, whether you were a fancy politician with lots of money and lots of land, or if you were just a regular average Joe. And then Jacksonian democracy urged states to award electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote. Okay, so that's what we ended up with. And then progressives said that we should have primary elections, giving the ordinary voters the power to select the party nominees before we have the actual general election, the direct election of senators, which we also have, and they introduced popular referendums and initiatives. So in some states, do you know how they can get enough signatures where they put a ballot initiative on the ballot and it's like a constitutional amendment, right? So all of those states that have that are a result of the progressives. So we are influenced in our democracy from all of these, right? So we're awarding our electoral votes based on the winner of the popular vote, that's Jacksonian. And then progressive, we do have primary elections. So before Donald Trump and Kamala Harris were the nominee for president in 2024, we had primary elections. So Democrats could pick their favorite Democrat and Republicans could pick their favorite Republican. And then we also directly elect our senators. And Texas is not one of the states where you can put a ballot initiative to amend the Constitution on the ballot, but lots of other states do. And we've seen that in the last couple of years. Since Roe v. Wade was overturned, there have been lots of states that amended their Constitution to enshrine abortion rights in their Constitution, or just protect abortion in general. But Texas is one of those states that we cannot get something on the ballot just by petitioning the government. Our constitutional amendments in Texas have to come from the legislature, and then we get to vote on them. We can't suggest our own. Okay, so this is what the electoral map looked like for 2020, which they don't have the updated one because this book was published before our election a few months ago. I'm filming this in 2025. So as you can see, the 2 states that offer a split vote, like they will split their electors up and give them proportionally, those are Nebraska and Maine. So it is possible that you could win 1 or 2 electors from Maine and 1 or 2 electors from Nebraska, and then all the other states are winner take all, that you just win however many that state has, okay? So the swing states typically are Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Also, Nevada was a swing state this last cycle, and Georgia, North Carolina are moving into swing state territory, Whereas some of those safe states, it kind of doesn't matter how you vote in those elections because it's predetermined that Texas was going to go for Trump. It was predetermined that California was going to go for Biden or Harris, right? So we tend to keep a closer eye on swing states. Like, it's pretty unlikely for a bunch of colleges to conduct polls in Texas because they already know what the outcome of Texas is going to be, whereas they might spend millions and millions of dollars polling people in Michigan because we actually want to know the outcome of Michigan because it's going to influence the final results. Okay. So what does constitutional democracy look like today? When people ask, well, are we a democracy? Are we a republic? What is the United States then, right? And the answer is all of those things, right? To make it nice and confusing, we're all of them. In 1787, you might have called what they created a constitutional democratic republic, okay? So constitutional power is like the source of the power. We outline the government with the Constitution. We do everything according to the Constitution. We hold elections that are outlined in the Constitution for offices that were outlined in the Constitution. And we exercise power according to the law with respect for individual rights that are outlined in the Constitution, okay? It's democratic in that it provides for majority influence via elections. So if more people want something than people who don't want it, they will most likely get it, right? And then it's a republic in that it has a mix of deliberative institutions, each of which is going to moderate the power of others, right? So if you were to have a dictator president, they wouldn't be a dictator president for very long before they get impeached, right? So we have all of these safeguards inside of the Constitution, making what we have kind of a republic, that even if 52% of people in the United States voted for a dictator, they wouldn't last long because the other parts of the government would eat that dictator, right? They would get rid of them, okay? So we're democratic, but not so much so that someone can be a tyrant. Okay, so today's model is more of a representative government. You can call it any number of things. Compared to other Western democracies, we have more frequent elections than anyone else has. Like, everybody's pretty familiar with having elections every November, every 4 years, but you might not know that we also have May elections and March elections, and we will pretty much have an election every single year in November, not just every 4 years, because you're electing all of your local politicians, you're electing your senators and your congresspeople, you're electing your state representatives, your state governors, you're voting on constitutional amendments for your states. There are like elections probably 3 times a year in your city, state area that you live in. And we're the only major democracy to rely heavily on primary elections, which I think is unique and kind of special, that not only do you get to vote for whether you want the president to be a Republican or a Democrat, but you actually get to vote in the primary in advance to say which of these Republicans should go on the ballot in the first place, or which of these Democrats should go on the ballot in the first place, okay? Now, there are some features that make us less democratic than other major democracies. So the fact that we have divided branches makes us less democratic. The fact that we stagger terms of office in the legislature, and then the fact that we have separate constituencies makes it slightly less democratic, but not in a bad way. Just like that is how it is described, not saying it's a bad thing. All right, so that's it for constitutional democracy, your presidential fun fact of the day. Did you know that the first president to appear on television was FDR? He was our 32nd president from the Democratic Party in 1939. All right, that's it for chapter 2, guys. Y'all have a great day.